purpose of the webinar this week is the same as our mission statement: having fun, improving lives. And I'm here to mentor, give advice, and help you improve your lives. And the first question for today from the audience, and feel free to add your questions into the chat, is what do you look for in an A player? And secondly, then do I know who my A players are? I think there are so many attributes you look for in an A player. I could go on and on, but simplistically, an A player is someone who acts like an owner. And in my career, with having employed thousands and thousands, and if you include the hundreds of thousands of seasonal tax preparers, I've had hundreds of thousands of employees. But even year-round employees, I've had thousands of employees. And out of all those employees, less than 5%, probably less than 3%, act like owners. So the first thing is, when you look for an A player, you look for someone that's going to act like an owner. Now, if anyone had a secret formula for finding A players, for finding people that act like owners, then it would be it would be as good as the Coca-Cola formula. It would be, they should write a book, because everyone's looking for those A players, those people that act like owners, and they're a diamond in the rough. And so it's very, very difficult to assess when you meet someone whether they're going to be someone that acts like an owner. So you try to determine that. And one of the theories I have that I developed recently, over the last couple of years, that I just that late in my career, is the person that they can illustrate that they're going to act like an employee if they're willing to take a position where they're paid for results and not paid up front. Most of my employees, they want X number of dollars up front. They need it. They want it. They think they deserve it. That typically, when you interview someone, 95% of the time when I interview someone, I ask them how much they're making, and let's say they say $80,000. And I said, how much money do you need to make? How much do I have to pay you? And they'll typically say, oh, at least, I can't go back, at least $80,000. So it would be rare for someone to say, well, I'm willing to work for less, because I understand there's an opportunity here. I understand there's bonuses. As long as I have an opportunity for bonus and equity, I'm willing to work for less than that. Almost no one says that. But to me, if you're willing to work based on what you produce, and that's what you're paid for, that's what your job is. It isn't to show up and participate. It's, what do you produce for the company? What are the results that you can obtain? And so one of the ways I've learned to try to see if someone is going to think like an owner, act like an owner, is are they willing to base much of their pay on the results that they obtain? Now, as far as, do I know who my A players are? If I don't, I'm an idiot. I mean, and it's difficult with most or most companies. Most people aren't good at doing enough to acknowledge their A players, or to show appreciation to, and it's very tough, because I'm, without getting into my own self, it's because everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has issues. Peter Drucker, one of my two favorite business authors said, people with huge uh, positives, strengths, have huge negatives, weaknesses. And so it's not always easy to take someone that's a high performer who everyone is, others are complaining about because they screw this up or they did this wrong. It's not easy to have the time with employees to go through their strengths, go through their weaknesses, and show appreciation, because not only are you confronted with the weaknesses on a day-to-day basis, but others are pointing them out. They're saying, and my favorite example of that, Peter Drucker talks about Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, and in his theory is that people that don't have huge strengths, or if you try not to have weaknesses, then you don't work on your strengths, and as a result you become ordinary, you become afraid to make mistakes. And he describes the Civil War, that Lincoln hired a general and he didn't want to make a mistake, so he didn't do anything for a year. And meantime, Robert E. Lee in the South is winning battles and skirmishes, and they have less men, less horses, less bullets, less rifles, less cannons, and yet they're winning. And I think it was McClellan, he didn't want to make a mistake, so he didn't do anything. He just sat there. And so Lincoln fires him and hires another general, and he doesn't do anything for 3 months. So Lincoln hires Ulysses S. Grant, and he's a doer, ADHD. He attacks and he loses, and he attacks and he wins, and he attacks and he wins, and then he loses, and then he wins a couple, and we're winning the war. But Ulysses S. Grant had weaknesses, and I guess the Congress, according to Drucker, wrote Lincoln a letter and said, you got to get rid of Grant. He's an embarrassment to our country. He's a drunk, and he's a laughingstock. And so Lincoln ignored them. And finally, they come to a group of congressmen come to the White House and sit down with Lincoln and say, Mr. President, you got to get rid of Grant. He's an embarrassment. He's firing his guns in the air at night. He's screaming profanity. He's got his dogs. I mean, we can't have someone like that that's not respected. And Lincoln knew he was winning the war, and it was just a matter of time till we were going to win the war. And he went to his secretary and said, James, find out what brand of whiskey that Grant drinks and send a barrel to each of my other generals. And so the congressmen went out with a tail between their legs, and they were sad, but they were wrong. And I'm a Lincoln, not one of the congressmen that are going to just not be able to put up with weaknesses. And you have to be careful, because if Grant had shot someone or done something and gone over the top, obviously he would have been fired. But you have to decide if you can put up with weaknesses. So one of the things you have to realize when you get your A players is that they're going to have huge strengths, but they're also going to have some huge weaknesses. And you just have to learn whether you can put up with those weaknesses. And so, yes, the A players are a joy, but they're also a nuisance, because other employees, like the Congress during Lincoln's presidency, are going to complain about that person because they're doing these things wrong. So it's tough balance to administrate. Today I'm going to do something unusual, and in talking about in learning lessons, and I'm going to talk about my past in starting from scratch and starting as a kid, and the lessons I learned along the way, because it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The When I tell my story, usually I say, well, I've I managed 250 offices at H&R Block. By the time I was 30, I founded Jackson Hewitt, became $1 billion company. I founded Liberty, which grew faster than Jackson Hewitt and Block combined. We opened 4,000 offices in 12 years. We were almost opening a new office a day for 12 years, top 10 fastest growing franchise ever. I'm the only guy that's founded two of the top 100 retail firms in this country. Well, those are all results that I'm going to talk about the journey of getting there, and all of and some of the obstacles, not all the obstacles, but some of the obstacles that we faced along the way. So first of all, I'm going to take you back to, let's start with when I was a teenager, and I fought with my dad tooth and nail when I was a teenager, and I was very rebellious. Not in my whole high school career, only one teacher liked me, and so I had dozens of teachers, and I sat in high school, and back then, and I don't know if they still have it or when it ended, but there used to be something called the National Honor Society. And my grades were highest grades, amongst my class, in the highest 5%. I watched as there was every quarter for your junior and senior year, there would be a National Honor tapping ceremony. And so you'd sit in the auditorium and they'd come and tap you to go stand on stage and be part of the National Honor Society. And I don't remember how many it was, maybe 10 or 15 each quarter. And I watched as it was almost exactly the top grades. So the top 10 or 15 highest grades, they got tapped. And then the next time it was the top 10 or 15, and I was quickly passed over. And I was never picked because there was the selection committee was the teachers, and I would argue with my teachers. I was self-confident, but back before you accomplish anything, if you're self-confident, it's cocky. I've told my oldest son numerous times, son, you're just as cocky as me, but I've earned it. But back in high school, I hadn't earned it. And so I was cocky and self-confident and disliked by my teachers, and fought with my dad. And as a result, I won't get into I don't want to say anything bad about my dad, because in the last 30, 40 years of our lives together, he was one of my top best friends once I got into business, and we had lots to talk about and work together on. But actually came to me when I was a junior in high school, said, I'm not paying for your college education. And to me, it was a silly thing, but I won't out him as to why he did it. But so first of all, I start with an adverse situation, but I'm poor, I'm cocky, I know I'm going to become a millionaire, and didn't know how. So I start college, and I started college as to be a mathematician. And I don't know the only reason I picked mathematician is I'm good at math. I don't even know what a mathematician would do. So I started college, and my dad also was a frustrated entrepreneur. He wanted a good relationship with me, but he also wanted to be an entrepreneur. And he had 5 children very quickly, and he was poor, and so he never had the money or the resources to start a business. But by the time I was in college, he decided that it would be a good for me and for him if we could get a business together. So he went to H&R Block in fall of 1969. And we lived in a suburb of Buffalo called Hamburg, New York, which was a fairly wealthy suburb of, by now, my dad's starting to make good money. He's a controller of a company. And so we lived in a fairly well-to-do suburb of Buffalo. And there was no H&R Block there. In fact, back then, and I don't talk about this enough, but H&R Block only had 3,000 locations. When I left 12 years later, they had 9,000 locations. So I was with Block from the time they went to 3,000 locations to 9,000 locations. So not only did I have growth at Jackson Hewitt and Liberty and Loyalty, I was involved with Block in their great hockey puck growth years. But he went to them and said that we'd like to buy a franchise. I'd like to buy a franchise for my son and I in Hamburg. And they said, well, as a matter of fact, we're going to open a company store there this year. Why don't you have your son take our course and see if he likes it, and maybe he could work for us. And so while I was in college, I took an accelerated tax course. The tax course back then was 12 weeks, but they had an accelerated class because we didn't have this conversation until after that class started right after Labor Day, and had this conversation in October, November. And so I started this 6-week accelerate class 2 weeks late, but I loved it. It was the most interesting course I'd ever taken. And I love the industry because it involved mathematics. And back then, this is before, not only before computers, it was before calculators. They only had an and machine, pull your handle and a machine. And so being able to do math in your head was a huge advantage. So I loved the fact that it was mathematically. I love the fact that it's a gray area and you get to argue. And because I argue with all my teachers and all my friends and everyone. So you got to argue about doing the right thing for the customer. And then customers are so appreciative. Most people that haven't been in the industry don't understand that a high percentage of our customers in the tax industry, they think of going to the tax preparers like going to the dentist. So I mean, the least favorite spot I like to go is the dentist, and they're the same way. They don't want to go to the tax preparer. So you got to help people and make them feel better. So not only could you save them money often by doing a good job for that customer, but you could ease their anxiety. So I started working at H&R Block immediately in January of 1970, and I became a superstar tax preparer, and happy. Next year I came back, and now they promoted me to a bigger office because the Hamburg office, being a small or brand new office, wasn't as big as some of the established offices in downtown Buffalo. So I went to a really big office, and all of a sudden I got a call on about January 28th, and the regional director and a troubleshooter from Kansas City Block headquarters wanted to talk to me. Well, my manager had been doing a horrible job in the sense that the returns coming through it needed to be processed. They need to be checked and copied and assembled and then given back to the customer. And he had gotten, maybe 1,000 returns behind, 500, 700, 1,000 returns behind. And they thought he had a heart attack and put him into the hospital. Well, it turns out that back then they hadn't invented anxiety attacks. He just had anxiety attacks. And so they asked me if in January of 1970, if I would leave college, and run these 10 block offices with 70 or 80 employees and 10,000 tax returns. And by the way, in disarray. There went into the processing center, and there was all these tax returns stacked high on tables that were waiting to be checked, copied, and assembled and given back to the customers. And customers were clamoring because they were told it would take 3 days, and it was taking weeks to get their information. So there was tons of customer complaints. So I talked to my parents, and they said, "Sure, go for it." So I left college, and by the way, I never got a degree. I went back and took courses after that, but I never got a college degree. And they told me that when they hired me, that I would become a permanent district manager by the end of by April 15th. After the season, then I could go permanent. Right then, I was on a temporary tax season job. Well, again, my manager was only in the hospital for 2 weeks because he didn't have a heart attack. He just had an anxiety. Now he came back and into a well-run district, and no one really liked him. He wasn't a good, I shouldn't say not liked him, because people liked him, but they didn't respect him as a manager. And he came back, and he was jealous, and now he came back into his role as a permanent manager, and I'm the temporary seasonal manager. So we worked together through the end of the season. And during the season, he told his boss, George Gunderson, that I was doing a poor job, and the employees didn't like me. And so he lied. And because the employees liked me way better than him. So they didn't offer me a job at the end of the season. So now during the summer, I collect unemployment, and then I come back the next year. As I'm coming back the next year, and I interview for being an assistant manager. Buffalo is divided into 3 districts, and I interviewed for assistant manager in another district. Well, it turns out that manager that I was George Gunderson, who was my regional director, who I met with and promoted me in January, and then didn't promote me at the end of the season. He was demoted down to a manager in Buffalo. So I was working for George Gunderson, and so as an assistant manager. So he turns out to be an alcoholic. He was a chain smoker. He would light the next cigarette before he finished it. Back then, you could smoke indoors. Chain smoker, alcoholic. He eventually didn't come to work very much, and I ran the district, and we had a great year. And he said often to me, he thanked me for the great job I did, and often that he should have promoted me. He shouldn't have listened. That he should have promoted me to a district manager. Well, along comes the end of the season. He recommends me, but his boss is a Bible-toting, very, very cold and by the book. And I had hair like this. My hair was sticking up, and that's how my hair grows. It sticks up, and he took one look at me and said, "No, I'm not promoting him." So now again, I'm collecting unemployment. And by the way, I had, when I was in college, in the cafeteria at the big cafeteria at University of Buffalo, there was a poker game that went on. So I would make money playing poker during these summers and collect unemployment, and then work again for Block. So I was seasonally with Block from 1971 until until 1975. And in 1970, in the meantime, a lot of the stories got to do with my friend Gordon D'Angelo, and I met him in 1970 and introduced him to Block the next year. And that year, when I was working for Gunderson, here's a lesson that I learned that was a great lesson from Gordon. Gordon didn't. I mean, he took a accelerated class, a 1 week tax class, and he was working at one of the offices. And back then, when we did a tax return, we had to check. But not only did we check for the accuracy of the tax return, we checked for the accuracy of the price. And I was assistant manager and mostly acting like manager because my boss was almost never there, and he let me do what I wanted anyway. And he, Gordon had done a return, and he charged the customer. Back then, the average fee was about $15, and he charged the customer $45. And the checker brought it over to me and said, "Wow!" That he said, "This is only a $27 tax return." And so we needed to refund the customer $18. So I went to Gordon and I said, you got to call the customer and tell him that we're going to refund him $18, that you overcharged him." And Gordon said, "I can't do that." He said, during the interview, he got the guy so excited. He said, "Well, I'm gonna write off this mortgage interest and the taxes, and you're gonna save $300. And we're gonna do income averaging, and I'm gonna save you. That's gonna save you $440." And so he said the guy was so excited by the time he finished the tax return that he gave him a $20 tip. So how can I go back and tell him I overcharged him $18? He said he was so excited, he gave me a $20 tip. And I learned a valuable lesson that in years later, and we didn't really come up with a name for it until Liberty Tax, long after Jackson Hewitt. But it's called Closing the Sale. We eventually did a film. I had some of my best franchisees at 2 or 3 of the best franchisees at Liberty Tax did they did a film on closing the sale, that you have to sell during the before the return's over. Just waiting till the return is over and saying that's now the average fee is $250, but saying it's $250, that doesn't exceed customers' expectations. You have to tell them, this is what I'm doing for you, and this is the benefit to you. And then you get a lot higher retention, you get a lot higher referrals if you teach the preparers to sell the service along the way and communicate with the customers. Most times I see in the tax preparation world, I see preparers sitting there and they take the information from the customer and then they're working on their computer, and they're not having, if they're having any conversation, it's more of a chit chat rather than this is what I'm doing for you. This is how this is going to help you. Oh, wow, that's great that you had that. And by the way, since you had that, did you have this? And the asking enough questions to make sure you get the lowest tax. Most errors in tax preparation, and at least a third of the tax returns that are filed are mistaken and they're error prone. It's not because of an error of commission where you add something wrong, or especially now with computers, where you add something wrong or divide wrong or multiply wrong. It's based on something you left out because customers don't know everything they're entitled to. So if your preparer isn't asking you questions and giving you advice, they're not doing a great job. So I learned a valuable lesson then that you need to teach the preparers to be salespeople during the process. And so, I laughed about 4 or 5 years ago. H&R Block has had a dozen CEOs since Tom Block left in 1995. So in 30 years, they've had a dozen or 13 CEOs, and they always come up with new ideas and new concepts. So I had to laugh when a few years ago they said, "Oh, we're going to come up with a new strategy. What we're going to do is we're going to pre-quote the tax preparation because customers want to know what they're going to pay up front." And while that makes a lot of sense, and some people want to know, you get a chance to turn them off before you sell them. And so it's bad customer service. It's bad customer service. If you can, to me, what I would learn is I would rather underquote someone and then honor that quote than to give them a quote and then change it. Oh, by the way, you didn't tell me you had a capital gain, so that's going to be an extra $30. Right? You never, once you give a quote, you honor the quote. But so now a few years goes by, and I'm a bum. I'm essentially 24, 25 until I'm 26 years old, and now they change the regional director, and his name. Bill Buckley, and his wife was the district manager now for Buffalo, and they have and both Gordon and I are working. Gordon's the preparer, I'm assistant manager, and they come in and they're interviewing for a district manager in Buffalo, and Gordon goes in for the interview, and he didn't know half as much as I did about running a block district, but I said, if you get the job, I'll help you. So he goes in, and Buckley, or Birchmeyer, his name is Birchmeyer, Bill, he goes in and at the end of the interview says, well, what's the chance of you hiring me? And Birchmeyer says, well, 50% or I don't discuss that or something. And whatever he said, Gordon said, well, I read that as 90%. And Birchmeyer was the kind of guy that respected competence or the good attitude. And he called him back and hired him. So now Gordon's a district manager for one of the 3 Buffalo areas. And Birchmeyer happens to be headquartered in his office. And so I'm teaching a tax school in fall for Gordon. And in comes the Bill Birchmeyer and his boss, who ran one third of the country. His name is Harry Buckley. Were come in to visit Birchmeyer, and they come in and sit in my class and during my tax class. So again, a huge blessing, because next thing I know, Birchmeyer wants to interview me to be a manager. So within a week, I was interviewed, and he said, during the interview, he said, it was a Friday. He said, can you meet me? If I call you on Monday, can you start on Monday? Can you come and start next week in Elmira, New York? I said, sure. He said, oh, never mind. Just meet me there. So he went in, and on Monday morning, he fired the district manager, and I became, in September 25th of 1975, I became a district manager. And I had 6 company offices and 14 franchises. And I had Ithaca, New York, and Corning, and Sayre, Pennsylvania, and Bath, and Hornell. I had an area that stretched 150 miles by 50 miles. And I finally became a block district manager. So now I loved it because, for a lot of reasons, but when you're with block, it's you're almost back then, you're almost independent. You're almost a self-employed, because my boss was in Buffalo. I would see him at quarterly meetings, and once a year he would come to my district. So only saw my boss 5 times a year, and I got to run my own district. And again, now I'm finally a full-time employed, and learned a lot of lessons there. And I'll give you a couple of the great lessons I learned while I was a district manager. And one was one time you have to send in your reports. This is long before email. And out of my 20 offices, I had one office that only had a referral rate of 11%. And the rest of all the other 19 offices were over 20%. And the way they determine where a customer comes from is the preparer jots it on a receipt. So if you either put a prior customer from different office, or or if it's a new customer, was it TV, radio, newspaper, or other, and or referral. And so he said, my boss called me up and said, you need to get over to office 9, because their referral rate's only 11%, and they're not doing a good job of referring customers. Well, what I learned is I went over to the office and talked to the supervisor and a couple of the employees that were on staff. And guess what the referral rate was on the next report? It was like 62%, because they knew that I was looking for the referral rate. And when you think about it, what does the tax preparer care about where a customer has heard of you from? What do they care whether, I mean, and I had 60 or 70 or 75 employees, and what do they care if they came from TV or radio or newspaper or billboard or Yellow Pages back then, or a referral? They didn't care at all. If you want referrals, John, you got referrals. And so all of a sudden they had the highest referral rate in all my area. So I thought that, again, in looking at H&R Block about back in 2004, it was 2004, I think. It was either that or 2009, that coming out of a recession, they had a horrible year. They lost 6 or 7%. They lost 500,000 customers. And I chuckled when the H&R Block CEO, one of the 2-year wonders or less, 2 or 3 year wonders or less, he said on the quarterly report as a public company, he said that we feel good. He said, even though we had this significant decline, we feel good that we had an increase in referrals. And I had to chuckle that you don't understand the business. You can easily have an increase in referrals just by letting your employees know that you need to do a good job. You need to do a better job of getting referrals. You know what? They'll check that box for you. And so again, lesson learned, but valuable lesson learned. And I've always believed that and I think that another lesson I learned I learned a couple lessons in one. And my favorite manager, Marianne Lepkowski, she ran the Corning office, 3,000, one of the biggest offices in the country, certainly in the state, 3,000 returns out of Corning, New York. And they had 2 customers come in, and they were sisters. And again, the average fee back then was less than $20. And one customer was $15, and they each had 2 different preparers, sat across from each other. And one was charged $15 and the other was $17.50. Well, they both worked in the same company with the same exact income, same exact W-2, but one of them had a little bank interest. like $17 of interest from a savings account. And back then, you had to, it's called Schedule B as in boy, you had to attach, if you had interest income, you had to attach an extra schedule. And H&R Block charged based on schedules. So Schedule A is $10, Schedule B is $250, Schedule C is $30, and so forth. So the sisters had different fees. And so the one that paid $17.50 called up the manager and complained. And she explained to her that why we were justified in charging the price. Well, that didn't satisfy the sister. She called me up. And one of the lessons I learned in managing customer relationships is I always apologize for a misunderstanding. And because it doesn't matter whose fault it was. And too often times at our companies, we feel justified. We didn't screw up. No. We try to explain why it wasn't a mistake. But I always, 100% of the time when a customer complains, I apologize for the misunderstanding. And I said, you know what? Did Marianne explain to you why? And they said yes. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you your tax return for free. So I gave her the whole $17.50. I mean, a half measure would be, okay, lower it down to $15. But I learned a long time ago that the way you succeed isn't to meet customers' expectations, it's to exceed their expectations. If you gave her a $2.50, if we gave her a $2.50 discount, that would just meet her expectations. She'd still be a bit annoyed that she had to complain and go through all this. So I just gave it to her for free. So Marianne was like mortified. She said, no. She said, now the other sister's going to know that she can complain and get her tax return for free. So she's gonna complain, and they're going to tell all their friends. All you have to do is call John Hewitt or complain, and you'll get your money back. Well, not only did the other sister not complain, but they came in for decades after that. They came in for 30 years after that, and their fees were always different, and they never complained again. And it showed her that the benefit of honoring a money back guarantee, a satisfaction guarantee. And so, in addition, I learned another valuable lesson then, that to save me work, because Marianne hated some customer calling me going over her head and getting all the way to me. So what she would do is she learned, in order to avoid that she had to follow my lead and to apologize. And then in a rare case, and it doesn't happen 2% of the time, it happens maybe 1% of the time, less than 3 for sure, that you honor your money back guarantee. And when you think about it, so she said, I stopped getting complaints from that office, and yet the retention went up, the referrals went up, the customer satisfaction went up, because they were treating people the right way. And so lesson learned, right? Honor the money back guarantee. If you set an example, they're your best people. And talking about A players, Marianne was an A player. We only had one fight in my whole life with her, and her and her husband were my favorite couple ever. And she would work. She had 7 children, and by the way, most of them went on after we left H&R Block. Her and her most of her children came to work for me at Jackson Hewitt. In fact, one of them became one of the biggest Jackson Hewitt franchises, moved to Albany, New York, and had over 25 locations. But she had 7 children, and she would just mostly work during the tax season. And her husband was a prison. He had a hard career. He was a prison teacher. So and the prison that he worked at was 70 miles away. So he had a long drive, and he would go and try to teach courses like high school courses to prisoners. And you can imagine how you're treated as a teacher in a penitentiary. And so, but she would, during the tax season, even with 7 children, she would be there like 60 hours. But we had a policy you couldn't get paid for overtime. So she would only clock in for 40 hours. And I said, Marianne, you don't need to be there all that time. You don't need to be there all that time. You have great people. You've trained great people. We have great people there. They can run it without you. And you have to spend time with your family. You have 7 children, and they ranged in age back then from maybe 4 to 18. And so she had some little kids. And I said, you don't need to be here all this time. And so I would say that once in a while. And so one time I was passing through, and I stopped in the office, and it's 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And sure enough, she's there. And I mean, she typically worked 9 to 5, just scheduled 9 to 5. And I said, Marianne, you shouldn't be here. You should be home. And she came in the next day crying and was almost ready to resign. That how could I be so callous or mean or in causing her to she was doing her job. And I said, wait, you're the greatest employee I have. I love you. You're just fantastic. But I'm just trying to look out for what's best for you. And she didn't. She was angry, and we only had one fight in all of that time. A few years later, when we started Jackson Hewitt, so I went through 5 years in Elmira, and during that time, H&R Block started a program that is called a regional director. And regional director managed. I was a district manager in Elmira, and my regional director managed 17 districts, and they had a regional director training program. And I didn't. I was invited to participate, and these were future regional directors. But I had 3 kids in Elmira. I married a woman with 3 girls, and then had a son. But she couldn't leave Elmira. We couldn't leave Elmira, and because of that she was divorced and the custody situation, we couldn't leave Elmira. So I was not allowed to. Well, so I didn't. So I turned down the chance to be in the regional director training program. And again, but that was my goal from 1970 when I was promoted, or 70, until 71, until I always wanted to be a block regional director, but I had to do it for the family that we couldn't move. But again, if you do the right thing, it turned out 2 years after they started that program, Harry Buckley, the guy that had sat in the tax class watching me in 1975 and was instrumental in me being promoted to district manager, he called up and said, would you be interested in coming and be the regional director in Philadelphia? And what turns out, the kids now were older, a couple of years older. It was only 4-hour drive from Philadelphia to Elmira. So it worked out, and I became a block regional director in 1980 when I was 30 years old. And again, happy. And now my dad interceded again. He was a CFO of a public company, and the name of he was a company that had great computer resources. There, many of you aren't old enough to remember catalog showrooms where you would go into a store, and there would be computers set up there, and sort of an Amazon on internal software. They didn't have internet or anything, but you would order as if you were in terminals in the location. You would order your product, whatever you wanted, and then it would come down a little chute, and you'd pick it up. They had very little sales display in the location. It was mostly just those computers set up, and you would order from the terminals. And so my dad decided we should computerize taxes. And so in 1981, we both left our jobs, and back then Apple computers were $1,800, and we bought Apple computers and developed the first tax software for an Apple computer. Well, no one wanted it. We tried to sell it to Block. Block was testing for free with Texas Instruments and IBM, and they said, well, they're doing it for free. Can we test with you if you do it for free? And because we had a novel approach, more kind of an AI approach, that we had decision tree software. No one else had ever done that. And they said, well, how much would you charge us? And so we said, well, we can't do it for free. We're just two guys, right? And Texas Instruments or IBM would sell you tens of millions of dollars worth of hardware. So we gave them a price, and they sent a nice letter saying that, well, we're not ready to spend any money on it, and but we'll keep an eye on you. So that was in March of '82. We made the presentation, made the offer in June. In the meantime, simultaneously, I had seen an ad in the Wall Street Journal for a company called Mel Jackson Tax Service, where he had died, and we went down. I put a group of investors together and bought Jackson Hewitt. Now, a little bit more on that story. We raised $129,000. Gordon, who I mentioned earlier, he went out and raised most of the money. But I had a great meeting with Marianne Lepkowski and her next door neighbor, who also was an office manager for me at Block. And now when I remembered, I left Block and said, would you like to invest? And I was so humbled that Marianne and Lee Lepkowski, they had 7 children, didn't make a lot of money. He had a full-time job. She had a seasonal job. They went out and got a $10,000 mortgage on their house, and to invest in Jackson Hewitt in August of 1982. And I'm happy to say that $10,000 investment 15 years later was worth $2 million. So not only did I change their lives, they became franchisees. Many of the children came to work for me, but it changed generation of Lepkowski's lives by that simple investment of, they took a risk, a huge risk. They didn't have enough money to invest. They got a mortgage and invested $10,000, and everyone that invested in that first round had the same experience with a massive return because they believed, and again, that was life changing, and that's the story of my early career, where I was kind of a bum, and until I found out what I wanted to do, and that's why my theory in life is find something you love to do, work hard, and persevere. Life's too short. On Monday morning, if you're going to work, you're not looking forward to it, you're going to the wrong place. And everything worthwhile requires hard work. And the number one attribute in business and in personal is perseverance. So that's our weekly meeting. Well, thank you again for your interest. And if you have questions in advance, send them in for the chat. or send them in by email, and I'll be happy to address them. I'm here to mentor and help you guys. And again, the mission statement of this weekly webinar is the same as the mission statement of our company: having fun, improving lives. Have a great day, everyone.